Hello and welcome back to the Alnwick Castle podcast. I'm Deborah Beecroft.
And I'm Daniel Watkins, and this month's episode is our fourth annual Shakespeare-themed podcast. In previous years, we've focused on Shakespeare's history plays, especially those like Henry IV Part 1 with a connection to Alnwick Castle. Those plays featured members of the Percy family, but this year we're moving forward in time slightly to look at Shakespeare in the 17th and 18th centuries.
In the 18th century, the first Duchess of Northumberland was one of the most influential figures in Georgian high society. A collector and artistic patron, she was also a frequent theatregoer. Her many diaries mention seeing various plays, including those by Shakespeare, while a small part of her collection was a set of miniature portraits of famous actors and actresses.
When the first Duchess went to the theatre, what was it like? And how was it different to the theatre or the Shakespeare that we might know today? To find out, we're joined by our regular Shakespearean expert, Ronan Paterson, and another very special guest. Ryuta Minami is Professor in the Faculty of Communication Studies at Tokyo Keizai University of Economics and is an expert in the long 18th century. We hope you enjoy hearing from both of them. We are very happy to be joined on our annual Shakespearean episode of the Alnwick Castle podcast for the fourth time by almost our resident Shakespeare expert, Ronan Paterson. And for the first time, we're equally happy to welcome Professor Ryuta Minami of the Tokyo Keizai University of Economics. Hello to both of you, how are you?
Hello there.
Hello.
Very good. Lovely to be back.
So we're here to talk about Shakespeare in the 18th century. And when people think about Shakespeare being performed in the past, they might first think of his own lifetime, places like the Globe Theatre, rather than the theatres of the Georgian period. But why is this part of history important for thinking about Shakespeare?
Wow. Do you want to start, Ryuta?
Okay. What it's about the taste and sensibility of the people of the 18th century have something similar to us. So we can share lots of ideas of the play, and that's still enjoyable for us. Just like Romeo and Juliet, produced by Garrick. David Garrick.
Yeah, it was a very exciting period theatrically. It was a time when the theatres themselves had changed considerably. In the 1640s, between 1642 and 1660, the theatres had been closed. And when Charles II returned, the theatres, as they grew back, many having been destroyed by the Puritans, they were very different theatres. They were indoor theatres as opposed to big outdoor auditoria. They were smaller and more exclusive, and the ways in which they performed had changed to suit those new performance conditions.
Yes. Particularly because of that, their acting style has changed completely with the introduction of actresses on the stage. That's an amazing thing for audience members. They were surprised, but they really enjoyed, women actors on stage.
The female roles in Shakespeare's plays were written for male actors. Now, there's debate whether they were all young men or whether mature men played some of them, but certainly in Shakespeare's company, they were played by male actors. And now suddenly, coming back from France, where they'd been in exile, they had actresses in France, and the new court decided that they were not going to have men playing women any longer, that women were going to play the parts. And this changed things in a number of ways. It changed things for the audiences. It changed things in terms of the playing style. They went from having boys dressed as girls in parts. One of the popular things in the Restoration were what they called breeches parts, which is where they had women dressed up as men, some of the younger men. I mean, even something like Romeo occasionally. The excuse for this was really because they then wore tight breeches and stockings, and periwigged perverts could look at them and be impressed by these gorgeous actresses.
So was Shakespeare popular throughout all of this time? Has he ever not been?
Well, actually, not quite at the beginning of immediately after the Restoration. There are lots of other plays staged, but gradually Shakespeare comes back onto the stage, particularly in the 18th century, with Colisiba, or probably the Hamlet by Thomas Betterton towards the end of the 17th century was a great work. But actually, in the first half of the 18th century, Shakespeare was just a part of the repertoire. But then changes.
Yes, it changes. Yeah, I mean, in the period when the theatres were reopening, they had no new plays, they only had old plays. And so there were plays by Beaumont and Fletcher, Ben Jonson, Shakespeare. Shakespeare's were less popular. They all wanted Beaumont and Fletcher because they wrote tragic comedies and romantic plays, whereas something like Titus Andronicus was considered hideously barbaric. But gradually, it's important to say that in the 18th century, as Ryuta said, Shakespeare gradually became more popular as the great actors started to want to play the Shakespearean roles. People were not seeing the plays as Shakespeare had written them. It was considered that they were a bit rough and ready. Shakespeare lived in a barbaric age and he needed to be improved for the more refined age. So they started to adapt Shakespeare plays. And this is what people were actually watching.
Yes. And because the structures of theatre has changed a lot, so the acting space and acting style have different, and the audience wanted to see something spectacular, like in flying witches of Macbeth, or the Ariel of the Tempest flying and just comes on the stage. So it's more visual and musical.
Yeah,
and so,
that's an important point, because the indoor theatres were now starting to use scenery, and the scenic stage had really been invented in Italy during the 16th century. But what happened was you got perspective scenery and perhaps an attempt to call it realism when we're talking about painted flats and things is perhaps over-ambitious, but they did want to see greater spectacle, as Ryuta said. And they could fly, they could have supernatural occurrences happening on stage, and they became very popular. Sometimes they would cut bits of the play to put more spectacle in. This was perhaps based more on techniques that came from the masques, with a Q, M-A-S-Q-U-E-S, at King James's court and King Charles's court before the Civil War. But they had scenic artists who could create this spectacle.
Is opera an influence on this sort of spectacle? Because that's very popular at the same time.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
But mostly Italian operas, of course. And the local English operas were there, but are not quite as popular as the Italian ones. So they paid a lot to bring Italian singers onto English stages.
The great superstars of the opera at that time were castrati, who had an extraordinary vocal range, because if they were doctored in adulthood, they could sing from the bottom end of baritone or even bass right up to the very highest soprano. And some of these castrati were massive stars. Farinelli is the most famous of them, but there were a number of others. But the opera, there had been English opera during the Commonwealth. Oliver Cromwell was vehemently against theatre. And there was a chap called William Davenant who claimed to be Shakespeare's illegitimate son. It's contentious. Shakespeare knew his parents. He was the godson of Shakespeare and had been named William after Shakespeare. But he always used to claim when he'd been drinking that he was actually Shakespeare's illegitimate son, but whether or not. But he had been a royalist and had been knighted on the battlefield for services to the king. And he was captured and sentenced to death. Now, some of the poets, because he was a poet, on the Cavalier side, like John Milton, interceded with Cromwell, so his life was spared. Now, anyone else would have thought, right, I'm going to go home and keep my head down, but not William Davenant. He went to Cromwell and went in and said, look, I know that the theatre is disgusting and immoral, but I would like to put on a concert which tells the story of the heroic defense of Rhodes by the Christian Knights Templar against the heathen Ottoman hordes. And we do this in song, and we staged it. And Cromwell said, oh, yeah, Cromwell liked music. And so by selling it as a musical rather than a theatrical event, he put on, in a converted tennis court, the Siege of Rhodes, which is generally reckoned to be the first English opera, and under the Commonwealth, that's what he did.
Yes, and also there's the cruelties of the Spaniards made by William Davenant.
The
actually
cruelties
a kind of
the
propaganda and support what Cromwell was doing that time. So it's really political in a sense. Yeah.
Yes, it was. And anyway, the Siege of Rhodes had scenery. It had painted backdrops. It had perspective scenery to an extent. And that was the first appearance on an English stage of that kind of scenery. But this caught on. There was still a proscenium in front of the proscenium arch. There was still a forestage. But it wasn't like the thrust stage of Shakespeare's time. But behind the proscenium arch, they had flats which could be changed and backdrops which could be changed to give different scenes.
Shutters and buttons were introduced around that time. So after Restoration, the theatre has got more spectacular, musical, and then what they wanted to show was completely different from what you wanted to hear in Elizabethan time. Or Jacobean time, Shakespearean plays. Yeah.
Now, I mean, if you take a play like The Tempest, which is already influenced by the masques of the Stuart court, it's got spectacular visual effects, a banquet that disappears, it's got harpies who appear, things like that. They didn't think that was quite spectacular enough, so Davenant and John Dryden, the famous poet and playwright, Davenant had been the poet laureate and then Dryden succeeded him, but they worked on a version of The Tempest called The Enchanted Isle, which was really replaced Shakespeare's Tempest for many, many years. And in that, they added a few things. They added some characters in pursuit of balance. You have Miranda, who's never seen a man before, meeting Ferdinand in the play. Well, they had another character who was a man who had never seen a woman, and there was another woman who had never seen a man, and Ariel had a girlfriend, and even Caliban had a sister. So it was all balanced, and giving more parts for actresses, because one of the problems with Shakespeare was it didn't have enough parts for women, for the actresses who the audience were coming to see. And this, as I say, this version held the stage for a couple of hundred years afterwards, really.
So was The Tempest one of the most popular Shakespeares of the time, or what other plays were popular?
The Enchanted Isle was done more often than others.
Probably the most popular one.
Yeah.
But apart from that, Hamlet was still in the repertoire throughout the 18th century, because before Garrick there were some actors who really loved acting Hamlet, even though some productions were not so popular as we expected.
Midsummer Night's Dream. Samuel Pepys went to see it and said it was the most stupid and insipid play he'd ever seen, and he was never going to go and see it again. So, I mean, a lot of this period, particularly as we get into the 18th century, it's a period of actors rather than playwrights. And we're talking about very grand traditions of acting. We're talking about very large-scale acting. Now, one thing that's really changed with the change of architecture for the theatres is on Shakespeare's stage, it's a thrust stage into the middle of the audience, and there is nowhere the actor on stage can look that they are not looking directly into the face of the audience. And so, to be or not to be is spoken directly to the audience and possibly even answered by articulate members of the audience. But, it is very much about that. You're on a non-scenic stage and you are planting the images in the mind of the audience, speaking directly to them. On the picture frame stage, you couldn't see the audience necessarily. So they developed this technique of sort of looking into the ceiling and thinking aloud. And soliloquies became overhearing the thoughts of someone. But if you are thinking aloud and being overheard, the play is taking place in your imagination rather than the audience's imagination. But anyway, that was a big difference. But it was a time of great actors, and the great actors gradually were drawn to the great roles. They wanted to be seen as King Lear. Now, King Lear...
That
brings it. Yes, King Lear.
That ends happily. That's something quite surprising for us. But that's the proper. That's what they expected of King Lear. So that's their genuine Shakespeare Lear. Edgar and Cordelia becomes king and queen and lived happily ever after.
Yeah. I mean, Nahum Tate, who is famous other than this for having written While Shepherds Watched Their Flocks by Night, that's the main thing. I know about him because he went to Trinity College Dublin, which I did too, and we knew about him there. But Nahum Tate decided that the ending of King Lear was too bleak and depressing, which is something that lots of Samuel Johnson agreed with that, and a number of other people. So he rewrote it, and what happens is Lear and Cordelia are in the prison cell, and people come to murder them. And King Lear, at the age of 80, suffering from exposure and probably dementia as well, leaps to his feet and kills two of the guards, and they're rescued. And Edgar comes in, and Edgar and Cordelia have been in love all the way through. And there are a number of other things. They cut out the fool completely, and they cut out a number of things. But this is the version of King Lear, which was the only version done on the English stage until 1838. Between the Restoration and 1838, David Garrick, the guy who invented Shakespeare idolatry, played King Lear in his knee breeches, and they always played in contemporary clothes, no historical costumes. He played Nahum Tate's King Lear, not Shakespeare's, as did everyone else.
Yeah, but that was their Shakespeare, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The great actors of the time, there are a number of people that we can talk about. Ryuta mentioned Colley Cibber was a great actor. There were great actresses. There's a wonderful actress who had a connection with Northumberland, a woman called Dorothy Jordan, who was the mistress of the Duke of Clarence. And if you go up to Etal and go into the chapel, you will find a little display about her. She was the mistress of the Duke of Clarence, and she had 11 children, or 11? Yes, I think.
Yes, 11.
And eventually they split up because he was heir to the throne and he wasn't allowed to marry an actress. And he said he would give her a pension as long as she didn't go back on the stage. And then one of her sons-in-law needed some money and she went on the stage, so he cut her off without a penny. But anyway, her son and her son's daughter then became the owners of an estate at Etal, which they had got from a grandmother. And there is a display about her in the little chapel at Etal. She was a wonderful comedienne. She was famous for breeches roles But Sarah Siddons, the great tragedienne of the day, didn't like her and said, "Her bosom conceals everything except its own charms," she said waspishly about Dorothy Jordan. Yeah, I mean, you know, but these huge personalities dominated the stage, and people came to see the great actors in the great roles.
Yeah, and what is interesting about this is in the northeast England, they often came here to perform. Dorothy Jordan as well, and lots of famous actors in London came to this area, northeast, and performed. Yeah. So the quality of the audience's appreciation was also very good. They're familiar with the high quality performances in northeast.
Yeah.
And particularly the Stephen Kemble, famous actor's brother, actually was a theatre manager of Theatre Royal in this area. I mean, Newcastle, Edinburgh, Glasgow, and South Shield, and Durham as well.
Stephen Kemble is a really dominant figure in 18th century theatre and in 18th century Shakespeare. His John Philip Kemble was the great Hamlet of his day. Stephen Kemble was a member of this great dynasty, but his distinguishing characteristic was he was enormously fat. I mean, he was huge. And I wish we had a way of showing the listeners some of the pictures that we have of him. Playing Falstaff, where he did it without padding, and also playing Hamlet. He was a very good actor and an even better theatre manager. And he, as Ryuta said, was manager of the Theatre Royal in Newcastle, and then he took over the Theatre Royal in Edinburgh as well. So he built a series of theatres in Alnwick, in Berwick, and somewhere in the board. Was it Duns or was it Dunbar? I'm not sure. But anyway, he built a number of theatres between them so he could tour his productions between them. One of the stories about Stephen Kemble, he was playing Falstaff, and he was apparently, in his time, considered the greatest ever interpreter of the role. But he was on stage at the Theatre Royal in Newcastle, and there was a legendary Tyneside clown called Billy Purvis. And Billy Purvis started off as a call boy in the Theatre Royal in Newcastle. And the curtains were in for a scene change. And Billy Purvis was running around making sure everyone was clear of the stage so he could take the curtain out, turned round, ran off stage, head first into Stephen Kemble's breadbasket, and the curtain came out to reveal Stephen Kemble sitting on his backside, wheezing, and Billy Purvis concussed from running into Steve. He was fired, needless to say, and that was comedy's gain, because he went off and became this famous clown instead. But Stephen Kemble really, not only was he a wonderful manager and built many theatres, Stockton as well, he ran the theatre in Stockton. He brought in many great actors. He really distinguished the theatre in Northumberland. Northumberland has a theatrical tradition which goes back at least to 1564, where the Earl of Bedford became the Warden of the Marches and the head of Berwick Castle, and he had his own troupe of players. And in 1564, the year that Shakespeare was born, they were performing in Berwick Castle, in what is now the main line railway platform from London to Edinburgh. That was the Great Hall. But anyway, in the 18th century, there were a lot of strolling players that would come through here. They would set up in different towns and villages. If you go to the archives office, or if you go to the Museum of the local printers, you'll find posters for Theatre Warkworth, Theatre Rothbury, Theatre Felton, all small towns. Now, they didn't build a theatre in those towns mostly. They would take over whatever was the meeting space, and they would set up curtains and set up seating and things like that. But Alnwick was different, and in Alnwick they had theatres. If you walk along Finkel Street, you will see a circular wooden doorway. If you come through the archway from the marketplace, it's almost directly opposite. That, until a few years ago, was a passageway with a sign saying, "To the theatre." If you had followed that passageway, you would have found yourself in Morrison's car park. But at one time, that was a theatre, and that was a place where performances were hosted, usually including Shakespeare. Not always. There were other popular playwrights. Hume's Douglas was a great favourite about the Earl of Douglas, and Sarah Siddons, earlier mentioned, was one of her great roles. It was also one of the great roles of Master William Betty, the young Roscius, who was a young boy who became a huge star for about 2 years, just at the turn into the 19th century, the very beginning of the 19th century. Many of them appeared in somewhere like Alnwick, no doubt inspired by the patronage of the Percy family, who obviously were the wealthiest and most prestigious family in the vicinity.
Well, this is why we're talking about this subject on the Alnwick Castle podcast. You mentioned a few things we are going to ask about. We'll probably ask you more about David Garrick. We might ask about breeches and costume. Dr. Johnson might come into things as well. But the first Duchess of Northumberland lived here at the castle between 1750 and 1776. And she was a regular theatregoer. We know of probably around 60 volumes of diaries that she wrote through her life. She's quite meticulous at keeping record of them, and she does mention going to the theatre regularly. Sometimes it's nothing more than went to play, but we've got a couple of quotes of her seeing Shakespeare. So on the 25th of September 1762, this is another character you mentioned, we have her writing from London, "Went at night to see second part of Henry IV, an admirable Falstaff." So Falstaff today, very popular, probably one of the favourite characters in the Henry plays. Is that true in the 18th century? We've mentioned Kemble.
Yes.
Well, the Kemble was actually active in the last 25 years of the 18th century. But before that, there are lots of other actors filling their bodies and acting.
Padding.
Things.
Yeah. No, Falstaff was always a popular character. Falstaff is a character who is popular in all sorts of cultures. I mean, when I first knew Ryuta, I was reading a book that he had edited, and it was talking about how Falstaff was one of the first characters that the Japanese audiences went to. There was an adaptation called The Boastful Samurai, and Falstaff was a character that transplanted there. But he was certainly popular with the ordinary audiences in England as well.
Another quote we have is from the 22nd of October in 1763 from Dublin, where she writes, "I went in the evening to Othello and was so much clapped that I was heartily confounded, though much pleased, as the Duchess of Bedford, my predecessor, was frequently received with groans."
Well now. It's interesting. Dublin was very much part of the circuit. It was very much a theatrical capital, and many of the actors and playwrights that were major stars of the 18th century theatre had begun in Dublin or come from. I mean, Dorothy Jordan that we mentioned, she began her career in the theatre in Dublin, but everybody went there, all the stars. It was one of the main dates that they would do. But Othello was a play that offers two great starring roles. And so in the 18th century and also in the 19th century, often rival actors would be cast as Othello and Iago and try to outdo each other. And of course, the more they battled, the more the audiences lapped it up. And could be very partisan as well. They'd be cheering there, and the other lot would cheer the other actor. The interesting point she mentions there about reactions in the audience, two people in the audience, is something, because up until David Garrick, the auditorium was lit as brightly as the stage. And you think of the design of those old theatres, the boxes didn't necessarily face towards the stage. they faced towards the other boxes or into the auditorium. So people were going to be seen as well as to see people, and of course, great gossip. There was a sort of vicarious thrill of the gossip and seeing who was coming to see whom, and throwing flowers, all that stuff. You can imagine the goss was great in the auditorium. But you would go and see who it was, and other people's diaries would say, at the play today saw my lady so-and-so and the Duke of whatever and Lord so-and-so all were there. It was a very important part of the whole experience to be able to say, oh, well, I was at a play with the Duchess of whatever, you know.
Yeah, just like Samuel Pepys.
Yeah.
But what is it? I found the diaries really interesting because she attended theatres from 1750 to 1770. Actually, that's the very time there was a sort of revolution in acting in London, particularly in 1741. The Charles Macklin played Shylock, and Garrick also played Richard III in the same year. Charles Macklin in February and Garrick in October. And they actually completely changed the idea of acting. So she probably attended or experienced that great sea change of acting. The diary is a very important and precious, invaluable record, I think.
Yeah. Yes, very much so. I mean, Ryuta mentions Charles Macklin playing Shylock. Before that, Shylock was played as a comic villain. Shylock always had red hair. Now, why did he have red hair? This is a tradition that goes right back to Roman times. And the baddie would have red hair. In the medieval theatre, Judas had red hair, Herod had red hair, everybody was there in their ginger wig. Even Satan, Lucifer, had red hair. You think, why? You go back to the Romans. The Romans thought red hair was unlucky. Now, if you're a 5'2" Roman soldier, which is the average height of Roman soldiers, and you're fighting against some Celts from northern Europe, who are about 6 feet tall, many of whom have red hair, and they also quite often fight naked. And if you're standing there in a line of 5'2" Roman soldiers with a screaming, naked, red-haired Celt coming to you can see why they might think it wasn't their lucky day that day. But what happened was Macklin stopped wearing the ginger wig. He thoroughly researched Jewishness, and when he stopped wearing the ginger wig, there was uproar, and he played Shylock as a tragic character, which tends to be how we play him nowadays. I mean, you told me some things about how he researched the...
Yeah, he went to see the businessmen or Jewish businessmen almost every day to learn how to behave, how to bow and how to shake hands and how to speak. So, in a sense, his Shylock was a really based, realistic one, realistic character. Of course, this Shylock is not from The Merchant of Venice. It's again adaptation of The Merchant of Venice, version, adapted by the George Granville. But still, Shylock was a very important. In a history of theatre acting, Shylock was a turning point in a sense. And then Garrick follows just 8 months later.
Macklin had a Northumbrian connection as well, because Macklin became acting tutor to the young members of the Delaval family. Now, of course, the Delaval family down at Seaton Delaval were theatre mad, and they put on productions in their house, and they got professional actors sometimes to join in with them. There was one of the great stars of the day was G.F. Cook, who came from Berwick, and he was in plays there. And at one point, they did a production of Othello, which they took to London, and the two brothers and the sister played Othello, Iago, and Desdemona. And Parliament adjourned early so that everyone could go and see it, including the Prince of Wales and members of the royal family. They all wanted to see the Delavalles, who, of course, they knew. I have read since then that some people say, oh, that's an apocryphal story, but I've read a lot of people who are pretty certain that it did happen, in the same way that it happened when Master Betty, the young Roscius, played Hamlet. They adjourned early to go and see him as well. There is, in Seton Delaval, they have a wonderful invitation to go and see the play, which is printed on silk and has the seal on it. But Macklin was their tutor in acting, so that gave him a Northumbrian connection as well.
Yes, exactly.
It's probably the time to get into David Garrick.
Right.
So could you tell us a little bit about who he was and why he's so important, and we will then tell you about his connections to the Duchess.
Fantastic. Right. Do you want to start?
All right. What is amazing about him is that there's a memoir of Richard Cumberland. He mentions when he first saw Garrick's stage, and he says, it seemed as if a whole century has been stepped over in the transition of a single scene. So he saw not the Richard III, but his acting actually completely changed the idea of play, performance itself.
Yeah.
And then we share that idea as well today.
Well, Garrick himself was quite a small man, and he came from Lichfield. He was the protege of Samuel Johnson, and he came to London, and he came, I think, to work in a vintner's or something like that. Yes, it was a vintner's, and then was looking for an opportunity to go on the stage. And his first appearance was, he was not named, it just said an appearance by a gentleman in the role of, and he became the talk of the town. I mean, Garrick absolutely transformed the status of actors. Actors were considered beyond the pale, but Garrick achieved such fame and such acclaim that the whole status of the profession was improved. Garrick made a number of theatrical changes. He dimmed the lights in the auditorium. He was experimenting with coloured light, projecting through coloured glass and things like that. His scenery was, particularly good. He performed in adaptations, but he was an absolute fanatic for Shakespeare, and he's really the person who created the cult of Shakespeare, and he's the one who put Stratford-on-Avon on the pilgrimage route for Shakespeare fanatics.
And he also changed the idea of acting. In the past, leading actor comes to the front and speaks his or her lines, but he also put emphasis about ensemble acting. So he had an eye of all the other characters, and he didn't let certain actors play in his own way. All the actors were asked to think of other characters and think of the play as a whole. So that's completely new at the time.
Yes, in those days the stage was lit by a chandelier, so there was a circle of light in the middle of the stage, and this was called the magic circle, and only the leading actors were allowed in it, and everyone else is stumbling round in the penumbral dark round the outside. And so the actors would often, if they had a line, they would stamp and make a flourish to attract the attention of it. But Garrick was someone who moved away from that to a more realistic style of acting, more realistic styles of staging. He himself was quite a good playwright. He wrote a number of plays, but he also wrote, for instance, his adaptation of Romeo and Juliet. He put in a scene where Romeo comes into the tomb and he finds Juliet there, and he makes this impassioned speech and drinks the poison, at which point Juliet wakes up.
So we see, Romeo and Juliet speaks to each other, and then they find that he's taken a poison and she's to die.
Yeah.
That's a kind of tear-jerking version of Romeo and Juliet.
Yes, they have this wonderful lyrical death scene together.
Fairly long one, actually.
Yeah, it's a fairly long one. Yeah, but actually, when you think about it, Baz Luhrmann did something like that in his film of Romeo and Juliet. They didn't have the words, but Romeo does, having taken the poison, see Juliet recover, and there's this tragic moment. David Garrick milked it rather more, I think you would say. It's like in his Hamlet, he adapted Hamlet as well. He cut out what he called all the rubbish in the last few acts, which include the death of Ophelia, the death of Gertrude, Fortinbras, things. But he gives himself a good lengthy death scene at the end of it. But he became, for the 18th century, the embodiment of Hamlet in his period. And actually, that was part of Garrick's great skill, was he identified himself with Shakespeare to such an extent that it was hard to think of them separately. And that contributed to the cult of both people. If you go to Abbotsford in the Borders, you go to Sir Walter Scott's house. Sir Walter Scott really invented antiquarianism. He was the one who was going around when nobody was interested in old things, picking them up. And he has a snuff box, which is supposed to be made from the mulberry tree in Shakespeare's garden. Now, that mulberry tree must have been 800 feet high, because there are people who have, dining tables and things. But actually, he was given this snuff box by David Garrick, so it's probably genuine, because Garrick was the one who went to Stratford and made that. But Walter Scott, who of course was so instrumental in the revival of so many literary interests, and also who coined the name The Wars of the Roses, for example, and which we talked about last time we were here. The friendship of Garrick with all the great figures of the day was something that had not really been available to actors before his generation. And as well as the theatrical innovation, there was social innovation. Therefore, if Garrick had perhaps lived even a few years later, he might have been the first actor to be knighted, although it took until Henry Irving was knighted by Queen Victoria for that to happen.
We know that Garrick was known to the Duchess, partly because at one time he brought over a Swiss artist called Jean-Louis Fesch to produce theatrical miniature portraits of actors and actresses in plays from the English and the French stage. The Duchess has 27 of these miniatures in her collection, including one of Mr. Garrick in the character of Macbeth, which we will show you now. So this is Mr. Garrick in the character of Macbeth. Does that feel like the King of Scots to you?
Yeah, this is the thing. You look at portraits of Garrick, and he's always wearing 18th century clothes. He's wearing knee breeches, he's wearing a tailcoat, he's wearing a waistcoat.
This is what he's got on.
That's what he's got on in this picture. And you see him playing Romeo in a similar costume, playing Hamlet in a similar costume. One of the things he had as Hamlet, though, which does not show in that picture there, but which he spent a great deal of money on, was a wig, so that when the ghost appeared, his hair could stand on end. Special effects are coming in a big way here. Yeah. But that's a lovely picture. Yeah.
So it shows that she's interested in actors and actresses as well. We also know that in her library she has a copy of Samuel Johnson's plays of William Shakespeare. Mm. So you mentioned Johnson before. How important is he to the whole story?
Oh, yeah.
Well, actually, Garrick and Johnson has a very unique relationship. Kind
Close,
of teacher and student, and but also
mentor.
Mentor. But Johnson wasn't quite happy with Garrick's fame. Actually, reading his Life of Johnson, and you can find sometimes Johnson was sort of jealous or just looking down on him. There's one phrase I remember. When Garrick was playing on stage, Johnson was standing just on the stage side, and he was talking with Arthur Murphy, another playwright of the time. And then Garrick came to him and said, "Be quiet, I'm acting, my feelings and disrupted." And then Johnson said, "Feelings, and puppets has no feelings." That's what Johnson said.
But Johnson, on the other hand, was the editor of Shakespeare in his time. He was the foremost editor, but he thought the ending of King Lear was too terrible to represent in the theatre. He said, if you want that ending, you can read it in the text, but it's too severe for the theatre. Yeah.
But also, I'd like to think about Garrick as today's something like a celebrity. So everyone wanted to see him, and also some people can see him, a real man. The ordinary people can see him far away on stage or just walking on the street, but
yes, he went out and mingled, didn't he? Yeah.
In terms of people who attended the theatre, we've mentioned obviously the Duchess, members of the royal family. Was it just for the sort of aristocrats, upper class, or were lower classes able to get to the theatre at all?
They could actually.
Yeah.
There are on the top of the theatre there's a footman's area seats, and the footmen were there and they're allowed to see plays, of course. And according to Samuel Pepys' diary, you can find some apprentices and the workers are brought by the masters to see a play just once a year or something. So there are some, ordinary people or journeymen have chances to attend the theatre.
Yeah, it was more expensive than it had been in Shakespeare's time. In Shakespeare's time, you paid a penny to go in, and you could stand there, the groundlings. If you paid another penny, you could go into a covered area. You paid another penny, you could get a better seat. And, it was graduated in that way. But there were social distinctions in where people sat in the 18th century theatre. But what they didn't do was have properly organised queuing. What you did was, if you were an aristocrat, you might send your servant to stand and Bagsy a seat for you, and then the Lord so-and-so would come in and the servant would stand up and bow and let them sit down. But people used to fight their way in. There's stories of people getting a broken arm trying to fight their way into the theatre. I mean, people aren't that enthusiastic nowadays. The downside of it was they were lit with candles, and if there was a fire, the losses could be terrible because there weren't many exits. There would only perhaps be one exit, and there were some terrible disasters. Actually, it's funny because the strolling players that we mentioned earlier, they would go around and the takings would be shared between them down to the candle ends. And sometimes there might be more candle ends than there was money in the thing, but at least in those days the candle ends were edible.
One way that the Duchess might have guaranteed herself a seat is the fact that she owns shares in the Drury Lane Theatre, and it's one of 3 theatres that she includes in a list of all the public amusements she had available to her in London in the year 1772. She makes a list. She liked a list. So if you were a part owner of a theatre, is that common for an aristocrat at the time, or is she just unusually interested in the stage?
Very unusual.
Yes, it's unusual. It's not common. She was obviously an aficionado, but it's not unheard of. Some people, like for instance, Queen Victoria was an absolute theatre fan. In fact, she was such a theatre fan that she used to go to the theatre and she was complaining about the supernumeraries, all the extras standing around being soldiers, and they were slovenly. And she said, these people are terrible. She offered the royal guards to be extras in the opera and in the theatre so that at least they could stand up and hold their spear properly. And that continued up until, I went on stage at the Royal Opera House with the last of the guardsmen that had come as part of that arrangement. So it was not unheard of that aristocrats would be enthusiastic, but it was certainly unusual they would be owners.
Yes, it's Duchess, you mean? The Duchess was involved in the theatre management in a sense?
We don't know how much. She's a shareholder, and the other unusual connection between her and Garrick is that her husband, the Duke, and Garrick were both members of the Company of British Cast Plate Glass Manufacturers. Northumberland House is their central London home and has a mirrored glass drawing room, parts of which are now in the V&A Museum. Garrick is using the same thing at the Theatre Royal in Drury Lane at around the same time. So we've got another connection between them, but in
really
a very
fascinating.
tenuous kind of way.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Actually, again, it's not surprising. In Shakespeare's time, all the sharers in the company were members of other guilds. John Hemmings, who was one of the two that brought together the folio, was a member of the Greengrocers Guild, and Robert Armin, who was the guy who created Feste and The Fool in King Lear, was a member of the Goldsmiths Guild. Now, this was partly about being able to take apprentices, but all these people were members of the guilds. The guilds were a vitally important part of society, certainly in Elizabethan times, less so as we got into the 18th century, but it was still quite a prestigious thing to have a connection. You know, one suspects that Garrick was made an honorary member, and certainly that the Duke was made an honorary member, but they had wonderful guild halls and facilities that would be used like a club, like a gentleman's club came to be later on.
It's an amazing discovery, actually.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
That's
The
wonderful.
world of the theatre that the Duchess of Northumberland is living in these decades of the 18th century, in some ways it feels very different to what we would see if we went to watch a Shakespeare play now. But it sounds like the beginnings of what would come to be the Shakespeare that we know. What would you have wanted to go and see Garrick play? Would you have wanted to see Shakespeare in this time? Would you want to go with the Duchess of Northumberland?
Yes, I would. Yes. She might not have wanted to be seen with me, but I would love to have ridden on her coattails to go and see David Garrick. No, Garrick is this meteoric figure in the history of Shakespeare. I think if we watched his acting today, I don't know whether we would be as impressed as people in his time, because he was the beginning of a process which then was refined later by others. But certainly in his own time, he was meteoric. The 18th century theatre was vivid, colourful, lively. It was also strongly locally rooted. There were circuits in different parts of the country, and actors went round those circuits, the different venues in them. But just one little thing, they didn't sound the way Shakespearean actors do nowadays. There was no such thing as a standardized received pronunciation accent. So northern actors would have sounded northern, and West Country actors would have sounded western. Henry Irving, actually, by the time you get Henry Irving, he still sounded West Country. They were saying, oh, he sounds Cornish when he's playing Hamlet. And well, yeah. So there was a strong local connection. There were companies that, often were based on families as well. So there was a real cohesiveness to it. But those actors had to walk from place to place and have dozens of plays in their head, because they'd get there and say, right, you're Edgar tonight. Oh, right. They go and do King Lear. What are we doing tomorrow? Why don't we try The Clandestine Marriage? Do you know? Oh, yes. They had to keep these plays in their heads at all times. So it was a very, very tough life. They didn't particularly rehearse. They got a little bit of direction by the leading actor, mostly saying, keep out of my way when I'm doing my thing. And they were poor, but that was the profession they had chosen, and they were fiercely loyal to it.
But about the Garrick's Shakespeare was more entertaining in a sense than today's, visual things, spectacular, and songs, and bridges part, women appearing in the boys' suit.
Yeah.
And they're completely different from what we know about Shakespeare. So, if you see tragedies like in Lear or Hamlet or even Romeo and Juliet, the impression of the play will be completely different, but really moving in a sense. So I think the Duchess had something similar, could share with us some excitement and enthusiasm with us.
Yeah, and we can look at those versions of Shakespeare and say, well, they weren't the play as Shakespeare wrote it. But without those adaptations, Shakespeare might not have survived, because they were the ones that were popular. They were the ones that kept Shakespeare in his position of eminence up until the 19th century.
So thank you both very much for joining us for this year's Shakespeare podcast. We'll see you next year and we'll do Macbeth.
All right. Okay.
We hope you enjoyed listening to our 4th annual Shakespeare podcast. If you'd like to revisit any of the previous year's episodes, head into our podcast archive and look for episodes 8, 33 or 58.
And for more on the first Duchess of Northumberland, we recommend heading all the way back to episode 5.
And if you'd like to see some Shakespeare right here at Alnwick Castle, travelling theatre troupe The 3-Inch Fools return to Alnwick this July to perform A Midsummer Night's Dream. For more information or to get your tickets, just make your way to our website or search for 3-Inch Fools at Alnwick Castle.
We'll be back next month with another new podcast. Until then, I've been Daniel.
And I've been Deborah.
Thank you very much for listening and goodbye.
Goodbye.